My reflection today doesn't actually start with a specific Bible passage, though if you want to read something relevant, I'd recommend James chapter 3. What inspired this reflection was how over the weekend there was the G7 summit, where leaders of some of the world's biggest economies had difficult conversations with one another about difficult topics. So Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, I think in particular, had some tough conversations about preserving the Good Friday Agreement, about the possibility of a US-UK travel corridor, about climate change. And those conversations might be difficult, but to avoid them entirely would be both foolish and harmful. And in reflecting on the G7 and the conversations there, it got me thinking about the challenge of difficult conversations in our lives. Now, I suspect not too many of our conversations operate on the level of sort of the globalised and geopolitical scale. But we too have to have difficult conversations from time to time, don't we? If we spend any significant amounts of time relating to other human beings, whether that's through work or family or friendships, then relational challenges will arise and conversations will have to be had. That might be a conversation with a friend whose behaviour is damaging and you need to point it out. It might be an employee you need to discipline, or it might be an employer you need to challenge. It might be one of those tricky hot topic issues around sexuality, gender and politics. And those conversations can be tough. And sometimes even the prospect of having a difficult conversation, it can stir up a lot of emotion, fear, insecurity, anxiety, pride. We often don't want to have those conversations. We worry that if we bring up a failing in somebody, they'll get defensive or worse, they'll be offensive. We don't like those conversations because we feel like we're not in control. You know, we don't control the other person and how they react. And it can feel like a gamble to have the conversation at all. And so we avoid those conversations. But in this reflection, we'll think a little bit about why it's good to have difficult conversations. And then I'll kind of offer some practical thoughts on how to actually have those difficult conversations, how to have them well. And the first thing to say in terms of why have the conversations is, although our fear of the conversation is understandable, I'd like to suggest that avoiding them is not usually healthy for our relationships. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to everything, but in general, unresolved conflict or difficult conversations that we avoid, those things are not like fine wine. You know, they don't get better with age. It's more like that rattling sound you can hear in your car's engine when you drive it. You know, you sort of put off getting it sorted, you ignore it, you sort of turn the radio up so you don't have to listen to it. But then usually at the most inconvenient moment, that rattling sound turns into a loud bang and your car judders to a halt. And what do you think straight away? You think, I wish I'd have got that sorted out earlier. So the most obvious reason why it's good to bite the bullet and have those difficult conversations is the damage that is caused by not having those conversations, the long-term damage. And from a Christian perspective, it's also important to say that tough conversations are important because God values human relationships and wants to see them restored and flourishing. Healthy human relationships are so important that Jesus encouraged his listeners to delay their offerings to God. Okay, and in Jesus' time, your offering to God was one of the most important things you can do in life. But to delay your offering to God in order to repair broken relationships with others. So Jesus said, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go be reconciled to your brother and sister and then come and present your offering. And that was from Matthew 5. You know, having tough conversations is part and parcel of having the kinds of rich, deep, life-giving relationships that God calls us to have. To have hard conversations shows our commitment to the person that we have them with. It shows the depth of love we have for them and that we care about them and our relationship with them, that we're willing to have those conversations rather than avoid it or walk away. And another thing is that we have a responsibility to help one another to grow. Okay? Now we've all seen a friend with spinach in their teeth, or perhaps with their zipper undone on their trousers, and we've done absolutely nothing about it. We've let them go to that meeting or out on that date without telling them about it because it's just too uncomfortable to raise it. But friendship, deep relationship, it requires us to point out when their fly is undone, metaphorically. It requires us to raise the issues with them that perhaps they haven't noticed or haven't thought about. I think we often think of arguments and conflict as indicating a problem in our relationships. But actually, I worry far more about people who never have arguments. And that's partly from my own experience, because I had a girlfriend and a fiancée, not Isabel, I hasten to add, for about 7 years, and we almost never argued. But that wasn't because everything was great. It was because we stubbornly refused to engage with any of the many problems in our relationship. We refused to have any difficult conversations, and ultimately our relationship ended in a very messy, very complete collapse. And so I'm of the view that done rightly, arguments, conversations where you wrestle with your disagreements and differences and hurts, they're a healthy part of good human relationships. If you're serious about deep and lasting intimacy, friendship, whatever it may be. And in fact, there are some cultures where if somebody spots a couple in the street, they spot a couple in the street arguing, they will observe, see, look at that couple making love. That sounds very strange, and not every argument fits this, but actually having those tough conversations, wrestling that through, is making love. Because in those conversations you are truly making, building, creating love, forming strong and deep relationships of trust and commitment. So if we want to have strong, honest relationships where we grow as people and grow together, well, we need to have difficult conversations from time to time. But how? How do we do that? Well, there's whole books on the subject if you want to take this reflection further. But I'm just going to outline a few ideas for you. And that's going to be about before the conversation, during the conversation, and after the conversation. So before the conversation, check your motives. What is the goal of this conversation from your perspective? What are your hidden agendas? Are you mainly wanting to unload? Are you wanting to make the other person feel embarrassed or make them feel guilty? Or are you genuinely seeking understanding and reconciliation? We always have a bit of a mix of motives, don't we, as people? But before having the conversation, we need to be pretty sure that godly motives of reconciliation and the other person's good, that those things are primary. And then, as well as sort of checking our own kind of perspective on this conversation, check your assumptions about the other person who's going to be in this conversation. When we're anticipating a difficult conversation with somebody, we tend to tell ourselves stories about them, even if it's only semi-consciously. They're out to get me. They've never really liked me. They're bound to fly off the handle. Now, past experience of someone may kind of give us reasons to expect some of these things, but let's be open, at least, open to having the stories we tell about others rewritten. And let's do our best to understand things from their perspective as well. In the book To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch puts this really well. He says, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. That's so much more vivid than stepping in someone's shoes, isn't it? You climb into their skin and walk around in it. How does it feel to be them? Take time to think about things from their perspective. What do they feel about what happened, about what you might have to say, about the issue that's under discussion. And thirdly, in that, pray. Okay? Pray. Pray that God would sort out your heart towards the other person. Pray for God's insight and God's wisdom. Because if you bring God into your preparation for a difficult conversation, it's a lot harder for you to willfully pursue the wrong thing. And because God is interested in restored relationships, I think we can trust that when we ask for God's help, that God is in that. Even if things are messy and not straightforward, that God is in that. So that's before the conversation's even taken place. But what about during the conversation? Well, firstly, there's a time and a place, isn't there? It's probably not while you're driving through traffic, or trying to get the kids to bed. And the time and place for a conversation is never going to be over text or email. Because if we're having a difficult conversation, we need tone, we need facial expression, we need body language to communicate clearly. So find the right moment. Ask yourself whether this is a good time and a place, both geographically and emotionally. A good time and place to foster good, clear conversation. And if it's not, can you wait for a better moment? You don't want to put it off and put it off, obviously, waiting for the perfect moment. But don't charge in either. Make sure it's a good time for the conversation. And it's also a good thing, if possible, to ask a person's permission before starting into a tough conversation. You might be ready for this conversation and need to have it now, but are they ready? And try not to force a person into a difficult conversation, because it's like backing them into a corner. Rather, open the door to a conversation and see if they're willing to walk through. And then, assuming the conversation begins, the next thing to say is listen. The letter of James, which you may have read by now, or you may be reading after this, it speaks a lot about the dangers of using our tongue and the power of our tongue. James advises us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. How often do we go into conversations with a whole lot to express, things we want to get off our chest, points that we want to make? How often do we go into conversations actively seeking to listen to what the other person feels or thinks? So let's really listen. Let's be courageous and generous in making space for the other person to speak. And acknowledge what they've said as well. And one of the best ways to acknowledge what someone said is by repeating back to them what you think you've heard them say, to check you've understood it right. Say, I think what you've said to me is X, Y, and Z. Is that right? Is that a true perspective, a true reflection of what you've just said? And that might feel a bit weird and artificial, but actually it really shows them that you have listened and you have heard. And that acknowledgement doesn't need to necessarily mean agreement. You can do the courtesy of acknowledging someone in a conversation and still absolutely be opposed to what they say. But at least then you're opposing them with respect and with attention. And then thirdly, during the midst of a conversation, do your best to respond rather than react. Now, in a challenging conversation, we don't have control over the other person and how they respond or react. But we do have a fair degree of control over how we respond or react. And by react, I mean those knee-jerk reactions. The other person makes a sharp comment, and so you rapidly make one back. If we're having tough conversations, it's likely that at some point during that conversation, we will get a negative reaction from the other person, particularly if they feel defensive. And we can react to those comments with comments of our own, or we can respond. Take a more considered approach. Take a few moments, a few seconds to decide whether and how to comment. They're split-second decisions, but actually to react is to escalate the situation. I think we do well to bear in mind Proverbs 12:16, which says, "Fools show their annoyance at once, but the prudent overlook an insult." It's so easy for our tongues to get away from us, isn't it? And for a few poorly chosen words to cause real damage in a conversation and maybe in the relationship as a whole. So bite your tongue before it bites someone else. So that's before the conversation, during the conversation. But the conversation, to have a good conversation, you also need to pay attention to the after the conversation, or the end of the conversation. And the first thing is to say, once you've wrapped up the difficult stuff, is to say thank you, to be grateful for the person, for their willingness to talk about whatever issue it is you've discussed. It takes two people to have a good conversation, and it will have required a lot of courage or patience or energy from that other person as well. So thank them. And then also express hope. Hope for the future of the relationship, hope for further understanding or progress with the issue. Hope that in talking things through together, you will have made love. You will have built a deeper, stronger relationship of mutual love and respect. And then finally, keep the door open if you can. Not all conversations can resolve an issue straight away. And even if the conversation hasn't gone great or achieved what you'd hoped it would achieve, it's important to leave the door open for further conversation, for the next stage in the conversation. Now, of course, sometimes it is right to let something or even someone go without resolving things. But wherever possible, an open door leaves open the possibility of restoration and relationship. And keep praying, because impossible barriers can come down over time and seeds will grow without our even knowing it. It's amazing what can happen through the grace of God and the Spirit of God working in us as we patiently reach out to someone else. So leave the door open. In a world that's full of sound bites and social media abuse, I hope you found it useful, helpful to reflect with me on the challenge of difficult conversations and having those conversations well. And as always, as is the case with anything I say, if you think it would be helpful to have a chat about your specific circumstances or questions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. You know by now that I love to have those conversations. But for now, I hope and I pray that you will have good conversations with those that you know, even if those conversations sometimes need to be difficult ones. Amen.